And now we'd like to welcome to the program to discuss these different developments here around Europe in security policy, and that is Mark Toth, national security and foreign policy expert and friend of us here at TVP World. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Marie, Don, good to see you.
You too, Mark. Now we see a couple high-level meetings, of course, taking place here in Warsaw earlier in the week with the Secretary General of NATO, along with Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of Britain, coming here to Poland, as well as Germany. Both of the leaders also made their way to Germany, Scholz and Stoltenberg meeting. And actually, I'm going to hit you with this first big question. It's a question on many people's minds, and that is concerning Germany and Mr. Scholz. Now that we see ATACMS have been already transferred to Ukraine from the Americans, and more are in the pipeline, Scholz is still saying that he will not deliver the Taurus long-range missiles to Ukraine. Why do you think that is?
$1 million question.
I know.
Right. You know, I watched his comments that he made. I understood them to be before the summit started today with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. And it was disappointing because, again, we heard a lot of defensive talk, a lot of letting this take as long, that we'll defend Ukraine for as long as it takes, a lot of chest beating in terms of being the largest military and economic supporter of Ukraine. And all of that sounds good, but at the end of the day, it doesn't get Ukraine any closer to winning. ATACMS does, especially these long-range variants. For a long time, they've been dealing with the short-range ones, which wasn't going to interdict Russian forces before they could get to the battlefield. Taurus is needed to do the same thing, but it has different mission capabilities. One of those would be dropping the Kerch Bridge that's connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. And it's frustrating that Scholz doesn't yet see that. He's got to get out of this defensive mindset because Putin is fighting an offensive war, not just in Ukraine, but he's got his sights on Eastern Europe as well.
Certainly. And before, with the tank coalition, that we saw the reluctance of Germany to allow the transfer of the Leopard tanks. Does the U.S. need to do something more to entice Germany to send those Taurus missiles?
I think they took a good first step, clearly, and it was a welcomed move. As part of a $300 million package, 100 or so of these long-range ATACMS were sent several weeks back to Ukraine. And we saw the devastating effect that they've already had in terms of hitting the port city on the Sea of Azov, as well as striking an air base in Crimea. So in that regard, the U.S. has led, too late in my mind, but still, they've led. And now it's time for Biden to pressure Germany to do the same. Scholz can't have it both ways. He either has to understand that he's in a war, and it's one that Putin wants to wage against the West, or he needs to fold his hands and let somebody else come in that's willing to take on that task. So from that standpoint, the White House definitely needs to pressure Scholz to do the right thing, deliver the Taurus to Ukraine so that it can use it against targets such as the Kerch Bridge and others, so that Ukraine stops defending and starts being able to go on the offensive.
I'd like to ask about your thoughts on the conscription law that now is being updated in Ukraine, because we're more or less celebrating, I suppose, in this re-energized effort to get ammunition and aid to Ukraine. But at the end of the day, we need manpower. We need the military to be filled with people to actually fight this war. What are your thoughts on what is considered to be quite a controversial conscription law?
Certainly more conscripts helps, but there's a long curve between taking someone as a raw conscript and turning them into a capable fighter on the battlefield, especially in today's high-tech type militaries that the West fights with. So it's encouraging, but I wouldn't get too caught up yet in it. It's a little disappointing, though, that because you've got the prime fighting ages, 19 to 25-year-olds, that still appear to be excluded from this latest conscription law. And while some may argue that it makes sense to hold them in reserve, the problem is you're not training them. You're not getting them integrated into these new weapon systems arriving on the battlefield. So from that standpoint, I think Ukraine needs to do more. I get it that there's internal politics. I get it that they're managing internal domestic pressures in Ukraine. But if I'm Poland, if I'm Lithuania, any of the Baltic states, and especially Ukraine, I'm starting to think, look, Russia's gone on a war footing. We need to as well, and basically need to start looking at that 19 to 25-year-old, horrible that is to ask young people to have to take on that task.
Right, seems like the logical next step. Now, I'd like to ask you about our presidents here, President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, as well as Gitanas Nausėda, President of Lithuania. They're meeting today. We just saw images of them viewing some joint exercises. But the first kind of thing I'd like to touch upon is the recent visit of President Duda before this $61 billion aid package for Ukraine was passed through Congress. Now, some speculate, and it's probably fair to say that he had a detailed conversation with Donald Trump, probably trying to garner support to pressure the Republican Party to support this package in the Congress. Gitanas Nausėda has congratulated him subsequently. And so I know you don't have firsthand knowledge about this, but is it possible that Donald Trump did listen to President Duda and would have made certain signals within the Republican Party to do just that and pass the package?
Difficult to assess. Donald Trump is his own man and is someone who's going to take credit for anything that he says and is not one to give someone else credit. I will say, stepping back from that at a little bit higher altitude, President Duda, along with Mr. Tusk, they both deserve credit for continuing to put pressure on the United States to do the right thing and get this aid to it. In terms of domestic U.S. politics, I credit heavily Mike Johnson himself. I think he clearly understood. He has a son right now that's in Annapolis, will soon be a military officer in the U.S. Armed Forces, and he understands that this is a fight that the U.S. has to win, not just in the short term, but the long term, and that his own son's going to get caught up in it. So Mike Johnson, from that standpoint as Speaker, finally took got some backbone, took a stand, and put his speakership on the line. He may yet lose being the Speaker of the House, but he did the right thing. So from my standpoint, I want to credit him. And I want to credit Duda and Tusk for continually making that argument that helped Mike Johnson get to that point in time.
Well, with Speaker Johnson, why do you think it was such a sudden change of heart? I mean, it was literally a 180-degree turn in position from day to day, from one day to the next.
It's, I'm not privy to the House Speaker's inside thinking. I highly suspect, though, that it wasn't so much a change of heart as it was just a recognition that he had finally run out of time. I mean, yes, technically he has a majority, but he has a majority of one. And that majority does not agree with him. And so he's basically riding a bronco trying to get legislation passed. He can't get any sizable legislation like this passed without the Democrats helping. And so I think he was probably in the right direction all of the time, but had to choose the right moment. And I think Iran attacking Israel presented that. And you saw that aid package come quickly when the U.S. had to step in militarily itself.
I had actually read somewhere that prior to that Saturday, there had been some Republican congressmen who had been in Ukraine and had seen the situation and had come back and actually spoken to Speaker Johnson, and that had actually changed his mind. So it was some kind of first-hand experience, and that was what had persuaded him in the end. And it wasn't actually any kind of internal conversations, but it was actually those images that had really caused that change of heart.
Perhaps, and still...
Maria, I think you're right, Marie. Mm-hmm. A big impact.
Yeah. And amongst the Republican Party, because this is also something that I don't think is very well understood here in Europe, a lot of people see some of the fringe members of the Republican Party and think that they speak for the entire party. As far as Ukraine goes, what are your thoughts?
I think there's still strong bipartisanship, Don. It's a fair question, and I get it. My earliest years were spent in Europe growing up, so I understand from a European perspective that sometimes American politics, although I'm an American by birth, it doesn't always make sense. The Republican Party, I think when you look in the Senate, you saw strong support of the bill. The three bills that came together, or technically four, into one. In the House, you still had almost half the Republicans voting for it. But the way procedural votes work in the House, you had some people voting against it simply because they didn't feel like it touched on border security at all, the southern border. So they did that for a political vote for come November. I think had push come to shove, they'd been the difference maker, you would have seen them voting for the bill. So some of that was just calculus on their part. I'm going to vote against it, knowing it's going to pass anyway. So that was something they could campaign on in November. But overall, the support is still strong. 3/4 of Congress supports this, and will continue to support it.
Which is a good thing. Very good. All right. Well, Mark Toth, national security and foreign policy expert. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us on TVP World.